Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. This is the fourth tutorial in our border series. In the first 3 videos in this series, you got some tips for figuring out border cutting measurements and calculating the yardage needed. Up to now, you've been adding borders with the border width based on our personal preferences. But what if you need to add a border in order to get your quilt to a particular size? Or maybe you want to fit a piece border around your quilt, but you need to make your quilt larger in order to fit all these blocks. In this video, you'll be able to figure out how large a border you'll need in order to get your quilt to the desired size. You'll also review how to find border cutting sizes and how to calculate yardage. You'll find quick links to these topics below. Hope you decide to stay tuned. I have 2 free handouts that you can download by clicking on the links below, or you can visit LearnHowToQuilt.com, click on Beginner Basics, then Sewing Seams, and scroll down to Borders. I'll be using this small quilt again as an example, but you can use this technique for any size quilt. Before you get started, make sure your quilt has been pressed. Keep this worksheet nearby when recording your measurements. This graphic represents your current quilt top, or I'm going to label it the CQT. These measurements will go here. I measured the length through the center of the quilt and came up with 26 inches. So I'll place that down here. Then I measured the width through the center and came up with 18¼ inches. You want to place that amount down here. My current quilt top is unfinished, so it has an extra 1/4 inch on this side for seams and over here for seams. In order to find the finished size of this section, I'll have to subtract 1/2 inch. That's 1/4 from here and 1/4 from there. 26 take away 1/2 inch gives me 25½ inches. I'll do the same thing over here on the width. I'll take 1/2 inch away from 18¼ inches, and I end up with 17¾ inches. If you're not sure about subtracting these fractions, then I've added a little conversion chart over here with decimals so you can use your calculator. So 18¼ inches, this 1/4 inch can be rewritten as 0.25. And then I have to take away 1/2 inch, which is 0.5. So take away 0.5. If you put that in your calculator, you're going to end up with 17.75. I'm going to go back to my chart with this 0.75, and I see that that equals 3/4. This measurement is going to be 17¾ inches. So I've got the finished sizes here and the unfinished sizes up here. Make sure to differentiate between the finished size and the unfinished size. This graphic represents my desired finished quilt size, and I'd like to write that as DFQ, desired finished quilt. I'd like the length to be 34 inches. So I'm going to write that right here, 34 inches. And then I'd like the width of this quilt to be 26 inches. So I'll write 26 inches right there. In order to do the calculations for these borders, you'll need both the unfinished size and the finished size. So we've got the finished size here, but we're going to have to add seams. That's 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch over there. So 1/4 and 1/4 make 1/2. So if I add 1/2 inch to 34, I'm going to get 34½ inches. And if I add 1/2 inch to 26, I'm going to get 26½ inches. So the unfinished size of this quilt top is going to be 34½ by 26½ inches. The next step is to subtract the lengths and the width. So I'll go up here to my desired quilt length, and that happens to be 34 inches. That's the finished size. And then I'm going to subtract the finished size of the current quilt top, the length of that, which is 25.5 inches. And I end up with 8.5 inches. I'll do the same thing with the width. I want to start with this width of 26 inches, and then I'm going to take away 17.75 inches, and I see that I need an extra 8.25 inches. In order to find how wide these borders are going to be, you'll need to take this extra length, and since there's 2 borders, you'll divide that by 2, and then you have to add 1/2 inch for seam allowance. 8.5 divided by 2 ends up being 4.25, and 4.25 plus 1/2 inch ends up being 4.75 inches. That's how wide your border strip width is going to be, and that's with the seam allowance included. So your border strip width is going to be 4.75 inches, and that's the horizontal border, which is this one and this one. So I'm going to write 4.75 inches and 4.75 inches. Those strips are going to have to be as long as this edge here, and this edge is 18.25 inches. So you need to cut 2 strips 18.25 inches by 4.75 inches. To figure out the width of these vertical borders, I took this 8.25 divided by 2, you get 4 1/8. Then I added 1/2 inch for the seam allowances, and I end up with 4 5/8 inches. So the border strip width that I need to cut is going to be 4 5/8 inches wide. The length of these strips are going to be this 34.5 inches. Please note that the width of the horizontal and vertical border will often be different when using this method. Now, I've added these little asterisks here because usually what I do is I sew this strip and this strip onto the quilt, I press, and then I remeasure through the center. And most of the time it's close to 34.5, but it might be a little more, a little less. And that's the size I actually cut these strips. In earlier videos, you learned about folding paper or making quick sketches to calculate the border yardage. You could also use this handout. So I've used these measurements to fill in these spaces in order to calculate the border yardage. So when I cut these strips, they'll be perpendicular to this selvage. My fabric is 44-45 inches. It's been folded, so half of that fabric is 22 inches. At 18.25, that means I can get at least 2 out here. So let's see, 18, I'll cut 2 at 18.25. For my vertical borders, I'm going to need 2 at 4 5/8 inches, and each one of those strips is 34.5 inches. So that's more than 22 inches. So I'll need to cut at least 2 of these strips, 34.5, and that has to be 4 5/8 inches. I'm not going to need this part. If I add all those amounts together, I end up with 14 inches of fabric, which happens to be a little bit more than 3/8 of a yard. So I'll have to buy a 1/2 yard of fabric for this border. I'd like to add different 6-inch blocks all around this floral applique instead of that red border print at the bottom. Unfortunately, you can see that the applique is shorter than the row of blocks. So I'll need to add an inner border to get this to size. For this example, I decided to sketch my quilt. I added the finished size measurements for the center and for the piece border. In order to find the width of this inner border here, I'll take the size of my piece border, which is 36 inches across, and I'll subtract the size of the quilt top, which is 34 inches. And I see that I'll need an extra 2 inches for this inner border. Now that 2 inches will have to be divided by 2 because that's for both sides here. So I'll take 2 divided by 2, and that's 1. So this border is going to be 1 inch finished size, but if I want to know the cutting size of that strip, I'll have to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the cutting size is going to be 1.5 inches. Since this is square, I can do either side first. So I usually prefer to do the horizontal first. So the cutting size of this strip is going to be 1.5 inches by this length here plus a 1/2 inch. So that's 34.5 inches. And I'll need to cut 2 of those, one for here and one for here. Now the cutting size of this strip right here is going to be 34 inches plus 1 and 1 makes 36 inches. And then I have to add a seam allowance of a 1/2 inch. So that's going to be 1.5 inches by 36.5 inches. So after I add these strips on, I can then add this top and then the bottom, and then I'll put another 6-inch square here and another 6-inch square here, and I'll add that to this, and I'll do the same on this side. Now I know this drawing's a little messy, but I hope it'll help when you have to add a piece border. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. We'd love to have you like, subscribe, and share our videos with your friends. Thanks.